Why are warm countries poorer? On one side, we have people who say, oh, it's all because of colonization. You have the colonizers who came and plundered and enslaved and left very bad governments that remain to this day. And on the other side, you have other people who say, oh, it's because people in warm countries are lazy and dumb. Well, today we're going to talk about why they're both wrong. The huge reason why warm countries are poorer that nobody talks about. And we're going to talk about a new factor that has never been discussed before. So let's jump in. This is a map of how rich people are, and you can see that the closer you are to the equator, the redder it is, meaning the poorer people are. And this is true across continents. Why? One of the hypotheses is colonization, but many countries that have never been colonized are poorer than their heavily colonized neighbors. Let's zoom in on Ethiopia. Ethiopia has barely ever been colonized, just 3 years of war with Italy, and yet it is poorer than its neighbor Kenya, which has been colonized for a fair amount of time. If you move north to Turkey, that's another country that has never been colonized, and yet it's poorer than some of its ex-colonies, like Greece or Romania, Bulgaria, Saudi Arabia. And you could argue that, well, for Saudi Arabia is the oil. But if you go a bit farther north, you're going to find Iran, which also has plenty of oil and actually is quite poor. If you move farther east, you're going to go to Thailand, which has also never been colonized, but it's poorer than its neighbor Malaysia, and substantially poorer than Singapore, two countries that have spent a lot of time colonized. So it just cannot be that colonization is everything. Many of the richest countries on Earth are in temperate areas and are ex-colonies like the US, Canada, Australia, South Korea, or Taiwan. Even countries like South Africa, Argentina, Uruguay, or Chile in the south, they're not the richest countries on Earth, but they are definitely the richest countries in the regions, and they're all in the same temperate band. So maybe geography has something to do with all of this. Some people think that warm countries are especially bountiful. They have plenty of resources, so they suffered from the resource curse. Despotic governments took over these countries and their resources, left terrible institutions, and these institutions remain to this day. But that's weird because the best agricultural countries, the ones that export the most, are all in temperate regions. This is because when you're close to the equator, it's so hot that water evaporates and then rains down, which means that there's a lot of rain in these areas, and rain leaches the nutrients from the ground. So the soil is not very fertile. Jungles can grow there, like the Amazon or, for example, the Indonesian jungle. But if you cut the trees and you put crops, within 1 season or 2, the ground is not fertile at all anymore. If you go a bit farther from the equator, you're going to find areas that are extremely dry, and that's where all the desert in the world can be found. So that's not ideal for crops either. You need to go a bit farther away from the equator to find temperate regions, which are the best for crops. Warm countries are also not very good for mining. All the best mining countries in the world in terms of export are in temperate areas. So warm regions don't have more resources to plunder than temperate ones. So what's the role of colonization in the poverty of warm countries? Well, the story goes like this. Colonizers tried to go to warm countries, but then they would die of tropical diseases such as malaria. So instead of staying there, they would take natives, would make them bosses, and they would tell them, hey, you have to enslave and plunder other natives. And that created really bad governments that have survived to this day. So, is that the main cause of poverty? The problem with that is that research now says that's not what happened. What happened is colonizers went to temperate areas and they could survive there. So they called their friends and they called their family members, and they brought with them their money and their institutions. And those were high-functioning institutions that worked well in Europe, so they work well in temperate regions. It was the know-how of all these institutions, but also their jobs and how to deal in an economy that really made the difference. Meanwhile, because they died in warm countries, they couldn't transfer this know-how properly. So plunder can't be the main reason why warm countries are poorer. But you know what researchers proved is a big factor? The heat. The sun hits the equator perpendicularly, so the equator becomes much hotter than any other region. And high temperature really hurts productivity. If you increase the temperature by 1 degree Celsius, your GDP per capita is going to go down by 8.5%. Your GDP growth by 1.3%. Manual productivity, 4%. Absenteeism, 5%. Performance in tests, 10%. Increased temperature makes crime worse and hate speech worse, traffic worse, sleep worse, exam worse. Another effect of high temperature is disease. You can see that the closer to the equator, the poorer, but also the more burden of disease you have. And you can also see it in this map where the purple is where there's still malaria, and that's all the areas that are closer to the equator. Why is this the case? Because microbes and insects thrive in heat and humidity, which are very present in the equator. Whereas if you move farther from the equator, it gets cooler and cooler, so they have a harder time surviving. Diseases, humidity, heat. It looks like we're really not adapted to live in Africa. But hold on, wait, what? How is that possible? Didn't we evolve in Africa? Well, here's the crazy fact. We did not evolve where you think we did. Here's a map of the human fossils from ancient times we've discovered. The little circles are those fossils. Let's compare that to a map of the elevation of Africa. We evolved in the mountains. All the fossils we've ever found are in the mountains of Africa. We did not evolve in the hot, humid plains, but in the cooler, drier mountains. Even today, the highest density of population in Africa is in the mountains. We can see it if we zoom into Ethiopia. Can you see here the population density in the mountains? People live in the mountains. Look at Mexico here, for example, and you can see that most of the population, more than half of the population, is in this small area here, which is the highest elevation in the entire country. In Colombia, it's the same thing. Look at where people live. Very few people live in the plains. Nearly everybody lives in the mountains. Look at all the three main cities of Colombia, Bogotá, Cali, Medellin. All three are on the mountains. Talking about the Andes here, if you go a bit farther south, you see where the Inca Empire developed. And it's all around the Andes, on the mountains. And this is very telling because the Incas are the only civilization that emerged independently from others close to the equator. It is not a coincidence that they did so on the tallest mountains around the equator. If you look at the altitude of capitals around the world, you can see that the closer you are to the equator, the highest altitude capitals have. And it makes sense. For every 1,000 meters of elevation you get, temperatures go down by 4 to 9 degrees Celsius. Enough to actually live comfortably. Here you can see the temperature of Lisbon around the year, from January to December. You can see it's hotter during the summers, and the band shows the minimum and maximum temperatures. And you can see it changes quite a lot over the year. Now let's compare that to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. And you can see that pretty stable around the year. Why? Well, because Lisbon is at sea level and Nairobi is nearly 2,000 meters high. So it's much cooler. In fact, many warm country capitals are in the mountains, and because of that, they end up being cooler than capitals in temperate countries like Madrid, Lisbon, or Rome. You can also see that around the mountains there is less humidity, which means that in the mountains, even in the equator, you can sweat to cool off. Sweat works, so you can be more productive, you can work harder, you're going to be cooled off by your sweat, and you don't need to stop working. And of course, with less heat and less humidity, there are fewer diseases in the mountains. You can compare here the burden of malaria, the malaria prevalence in Africa, and you can see that there's much less malaria in the mountains. But mountains have a big problem too. A huge problem with mountains is that you have to cross them. And it's not easy. It's very hard to move around in mountain areas. And that means that transportation is very expensive. That means that you cannot have a lot of trade. And trade is what brings wealth. So without trade, you don't have wealth. And without transportation, you don't have trade. Compare that with flat plains with navigable rivers. You can have boats there that carry a ton of goods, and that means transportation is very cheap, which means that trade is possible. But that's not the only problem. There's another one: conflict. When you cannot communicate easily, cultures diverge. You don't share the same culture, you don't share the same ideas, you don't exchange ideas, goods with other people, and so you're not close to each other. So that leads to the process of balkanization. Small regions, even nearby, are going to be enemies. They're not going to like each other because they don't share the same culture and trade and commerce. And that creates ethnic conflict. And that's why you find so much conflict in so many mountain places like Mexico, Colombia, Afghanistan. You can see on these maps how the areas of Africa that have the most mountains are also the ones that have the most ethnic conflict. So people in warm countries could choose their poison. They could live in plains where they had more heat, more diseases, less sweat, which means lower productivity and lower wealth. Or they could choose mountains where they had high transportation costs, which meant less trade. Also, they had conflicts, which also reduced productivity and wealth. They had to choose between the poverty of hot plains or the poverty of cold mountains. If you want to know more about geography, geopolitics, and how the world works, subscribe to our channels and to my newsletter, Uncharted Territories. The links are in the comments. In the meanwhile, this is another video I'm sure you're going to enjoy.